Chapter 8, Part 2. Is the concept of redemption necessary? Barbaric animal sacrifice. The phrase barbaric animal sacrifice may seem overly harsh to some, particularly when viewed in the context of ancient pastoral societies. In those times, the killing of animals for food was a routine aspect of daily life, and sacrificial rituals were an extension of this practicality. However, these rituals often stemmed from the ignorance of the masses. They functioned less as genuine acts of devotion and more as a transactional system, a kind of tax for the gods. While ostensibly benefiting the tribes, the sacrifices frequently served the interests of the creative elites who devised them, ensuring their privileged access to the sacrificial offerings and their proximity to the meat cauldrons. Abrahamic religions practiced similar sacrificial rites but assigned them distinct symbolic meanings. In Christianity, for instance, animal sacrifices were interpreted as precursors to Christ's atoning sacrifice, a temporary substitute or advance payment, foreshadowing the ultimate price to be paid. Forgiveness was granted to the sinner, but only if they understood the symbolic significance of the ritual. At its core, the message was clear. Sin leads to death, a principle established as early as Eden. The sacrifice acted as a proxy, with the life of another being taken in place of the sinner. While not all Christian denominations attribute the role of the sacrificial substitute directly to God, the underlying symbolism of sin's consequences remains central. In many cases, the sacrificial act was performed by the sinners themselves, forcing them to confront the reality of taking a life. This act served as a visceral reminder of the suffering caused by sin and left a lasting impression on the individual's consciousness. That said, one might question whether the destruction of life through animal sacrifice was truly the most impactful method of illustrating the gravity of sin. In an era where the killing of animals, and even people, was disturbingly common, the emotional weight of such acts may have been dulled by familiarity. This desensitization highlights why more abstract or less visceral symbols, such as the burning of aromatic herbs or the crushing of tomatoes underfoot, would likely fail to evoke the same emotional resonance. One might argue that the most emotionally compelling spectacle would be a direct observation of God's suffering. However, to achieve this, God's inconceivable emotions would need to be visualized through some form of imagery. Even if presented as a projection visible to all, this would impose continuous psychological pressure on humanity. God's suffering would appear as concentrated manifestations of all human suffering, transforming such a revelation into a relentless hologram of horrors. This would reduce life to perpetual torment, a reality entirely at odds with what an ideal God would desire for humanity. If we were to narrow the depiction of God's suffering to a limited set of images, focused specifically on the direct consequences of an individual's violation of the natural order, it might reduce the emotional weight. However, even this approach would infringe on individual autonomy, denying people the ability to live without the oppressive awareness of divine intervention. Such a scenario would strip them of their sense of independence, making it impossible to perceive themselves as the architects of their own destiny. It is reasonable to consider a form of awareness that respects personal boundaries, manifesting not as supernatural projections, but as internal feelings. These might emerge through negative emotions or concerns triggered by violations of established life norms. This approach avoids overt coercion, instead pointing to an internal moral compass whose origins remain open to interpretation. For many, this inner sense of alignment, or dissonance with God's suffering, might suffice to determine whether it is close to them or not. To increase the probability of moral alignment and create the necessary balance for an alternative choice, God provided humanity with more tangible images, narratives that symbolically depicted the suffering of the laws of life. These references, however, were deliberately crafted as indirect, leaving enough ambiguity to preserve human freedom. By avoiding an overwhelming revelation of reality, something that might prove mentally unbearable for some, this approach ensures that individuals are not coerced into belief, but are instead free to reason and self-reflect. Each person must navigate this spectrum of moral worldviews, determining for themselves what they consider good and right. The closer a person aligns with the global objective good through conscious desire, the more likely they are to avoid suffering in eternity. However, there was a time when God entrusted a particular group of individuals, perhaps the only ones willing to serve as conduits for preserving this informational balance. Given the high stakes of their mission, divine intervention during this period took on more decisive and unequivocal forms. Explicit physical manifestations, such as miracles and tangible representations of suffering, were permitted to prevent humanity's desire to follow God from fading into obscurity. In the case of Abraham, the progenitor of this tribe, even more radical methods were employed to convey the same truths. Naturally, the use of the most vivid images of human sacrifice to convey the same information was omitted, as such an approach would contradict God's intention to transform human consciousness without annihilating their personalities. The exception was a singular, vivid image of God's suffering, embodied in the crucifixion, a moment so impactful that it transformed the consciousness of those who witnessed it directly, as well as countless generations that followed. This event altered the trajectory of human history, giving rise to the values and moral frameworks that underpin our civilization, one founded on the inherent worth of human life, a principle for which God not only died but continues to die. The enclosed principle of the infinite observer. In developing a concept of a perfect deity that remains rational even in the presence of natural evil, we arrive at the following principles. First, the allowance of evil. Evil is a necessary condition for preserving the individuality and self-awareness of sentient beings. This is achieved by ensuring the autonomy of thought and creating an environment in which subjective desires can be realized. Second, maximum compassion. The deity exhibits boundless compassion, which mentally alleviates the suffering of individuals. This process is intricately tied to a multi-level illustrative system that shapes human consciousness through emotional responses and moral growth. While these principles form the foundation of our understanding, intellectual honesty demands that we also explore all logically possible hypotheses concerning God's maximum sacrifice. Such an approach serves three purposes: to test the boundaries of this conceptual framework, to identify potential contradictions or overlooked dimensions, to deepen understanding of the relationship between divine perfection and the existence of evil. One such ultimate sacrifice of God could, quite fittingly, be proposed by antinatalists. Surely, if they're serious about absolute success, their efforts should be directed at convincing God himself. However, earlier in our study, we dismissed this most radical idea. First and foremost, we acknowledge that the value of self-awareness and existence far outweighs the negative aspects of sporadic suffering. The same holds true for humanity, where the subjective perception of suffering can vary significantly depending on an individual's worldview. Moreover, faith, even if God is merely a hypothesis, offers practical benefits by reducing suffering. Most importantly, there remains the prospect of eternal bliss for those who manage to abandon self-destructive personal and collective ideas. And who knows? Antinatalists might be in for a shock, with grateful tears in their eyes when they discover just how many latent supporters they've had all along. There is another possible interpretation of the necessarily maximum sacrifice rooted in the principle of the infinite observer. It is generally understood that if, within the space-time continuum, we substitute the abstract observer, not as a simple abstract recorder, but as a consciousness capable of existing outside of time, this consciousness, by definition, becomes the very essence of non-spatial infinity. As a result, every emerging event not only does not escape its notice, but also literally occurs within this infinity, existing in a static, timeless state relative to it. To visualize this, imagine parallel screens, each displaying a single frame of a three-dimensional film. Every change in the positions of material particles is eternally present before the gaze of this timeless observer. While within space and time events have beginnings and ends, to infinity they are eternal, static yet integral components of infinity itself. These formulations present critical issues. If every event becomes eternal and unchangeable within this infinity, the observer and the events must either merge or exist in perpetual interaction. This dynamic would effectively elevate the events themselves to the status of a deity, an infinite static source of all suffering and the suffering itself. Such a conception of a deity inherently bound to imperfection negates the very concept of divine perfection. The imperfection of this hypothetical deity disqualifies it from the framework of an ideal God. Yet, this discrepancy does not invalidate the logical structure of the theory under consideration. The central question remains, do the initial assumptions of the infinite observer principle contain inherent flaws? If left unchallenged, these assumptions could lead to a paradoxical conclusion that if God exists, he must necessarily be limited. Such a conclusion would undermine the very definition of God, placing metaphorical nails in the coffin of the ideal model of God we are striving to construct. Such a premise overlooks a fundamental distinction. Information, when considered within the framework of past and future, cannot possess the same material quality as matter in the present moment. Just as the illusion of a burning star is merely the remnant photon stream from an extinguished sun, past and future events exist as inactive, non-material constructs. Even in the most abstract models, a timeless observer records events as information where past and future are non-actualized states. These events belong to an infinite set of possibilities, existing on the same conceptual plane as countless alternate scenarios of past and future events, each with atoms shifted in arbitrary sequences. Within this framework, these multiple informational possibilities remain finite when compared to the concept of true infinity. Even if these datasets vastly exceed Graham's number, which if written in decimal form using font size 5, would occupy all the space in the observable universe, mathematicians must resort to special notations to describe such colossal magnitudes. Yet even these staggering quantities pale in comparison to true infinity. In the realm of true infinity, such immense datasets are but an imperceptible speck in an immeasurable ocean of information. Consequently, past and future events within infinity are localized and static, a mere collection of non-actualized informational states encompassing every conceivable and inconceivable scenario. A helpful analogy can be drawn from human memory. Our memories are physical, energetic representations stored on tangible media such as neural pathways in the brain. They do not replay simultaneously, but are activated selectively in response to interactions with reality, where consciousness merely recombines data from reality in a semi-autonomous mode. Similarly, in the context of infinite information, it is the will of the observer that determines which data is activated. Here, activation refers not simply to awareness, but to the manifestation of selected information within the space-time continuum. As previously discussed, we are dealing with abstract concepts, and our inquiry operates within the realm of logical reasoning rather than empirical evidence. This focus allows us to examine the internal consistency and implications of the ideas under consideration without being bound by physical proof. A critical distinction emerges from this approach. God does not suffer mental anguish from knowing all information or every possible combination of evil. Rather, his suffering arises only when individuals directly experience suffering. Information about the past and future as part of the overarching backdrop of data does not suffer itself. The conclusion follows: God has not suffered and will not suffer eternally. His current sufferings are a local episode, endured entirely for the sake of others without any regard for his own interest. Moving beyond logical deductions, let us explore how an infinite observer might perceive events by drawing on a relatable analogy: human consciousness. For the sake of this exercise, imagine infinity compressed into a finite span of time. Let's say a few seconds. Within this interval, your consciousness cannot operate in isolation from either the past or the future. Consider the experience of listening to music. The pleasure derived from a melody does not come from hearing each note in isolation, but from the interplay of past notes remembered and future notes anticipated. Without the ability to recall previous sounds or anticipate forthcoming ones, the melody would disintegrate into meaningless noise. This principle becomes even more apparent in physical activities. Take brushing your teeth. Each motion is informed by past experience and directed by an expectation of the next movement. Even reflexive actions depend on this principle. The brain subconsciously integrates past actions and future goals to coordinate every motion, while the reflex itself is triggered in pursuit of a purpose, a projection of the future informed by the past. The human brain simply cannot function within the momentary here and now alone. While the here and now represents our physical reality, consciousness consistently extends beyond it, engaging with and transcending immediate reality. Could this interplay between physical presence and transcendent awareness represent a microcosm of infinity within human existence? And yet, even as our consciousness continuously interacts with past and future, we remain acutely aware of the distinction between stored representations of reality, our memories and projections, and reality itself. This duality underscores the profound complexity inherent in how we perceive and process existence. If we entertain the possibility of a boundless mind and omnipotent consciousness, it seems plausible that such a mind would leave behind traces of its nature. In this context, the mechanism of human consciousness may itself serve as a clue, a compressed and allegorical representation of infinity. The limited scope of imparted information. A reasonable question might arise when discussing the transformation of consciousness and behavior through divine images of redemption. Why did scientific information change the world faster than knowledge imparted by God? If God foresaw that scientific knowledge would drive civilization forward and reshape human behavior, why not provide humanity with comprehensive encyclopedias detailing natural laws and their practical applications from the outset? Such reasoning, while intriguing, is fundamentally naive. Imagine encountering an isolated tribe with little exposure to the outside world. Would your first action be to explain, using their limited vocabulary and understanding, how to make gunpowder so they could finally have matches instead of sparks? Or perhaps warn them of the catastrophic dangers of rejecting egalitarianism centuries later? And naturally, address their troubling lack of awareness about toxic masculinity? Even if they regarded you as a deity and were willing to follow your instructions, such an approach would almost certainly lead to disastrous outcomes. Internecine conflict, societal upheaval, or annihilation by rival tribes unable to comprehend or accept such radical shifts. A far more effective approach in such situations would begin with understanding the psychological characteristics, cultural traditions, and established customs of the people in question. Change must be incremental, grounded in their current reality. Your first task would be to earn their trust by demonstrating that your intentions align with their well-being and prosperity. By showing that your guidance leads to tangible improvements in their lives, you lay a foundation for further influence. Without this foundation, even the most advanced instructions would either be rendered meaningless or actively resisted. Imagine further that you have provided numerous assurances and warnings about the consequences of their extinction. Naturally, your first steps would focus on addressing the immediate threats to their survival. You would teach them basic principles of hygiene, warn them about potential dangers, and help them mitigate harmful practices. Now consider an even more critical scenario on another planet, where all predictions indicate that the tribes are doomed to extinction and where their survival depends entirely on your guidance. If this tribe is the only one willing to engage with you after failed attempts with others, your approach must be both protective and strategic. In such a scenario, you would likely take measures to physically shield this tribe from hostile tribes, ensuring they are not annihilated or overwhelmed by rival ideologies. This protective approach would be justified only if you could clearly foresee that this tribe had the potential to become a beacon of change, spreading your values and moral principles to others. Over time, their influence could reshape the mindsets of neighboring tribes, steering them away from self-destructive tendencies and toward a deeper understanding of reality, a path that leads to the progress of civilization. Jumping ahead prematurely, introducing advanced concepts without first addressing the obstacles to survival and communication would be not only ineffective, but disastrously short-sighted. Summarizing these arguments, it becomes clear that no approach to influencing human consciousness could be more effective than the use of an emotional image, one so profound in scale that it transcends any possible analogy. Despite the limited awareness of ancient peoples and the harsh realities of survival in their time, emotional perception has always been universal. Take, for example, the paradoxical case of slavery. Across epochs, nations, and levels of civilization, slavery has consistently evoked a visceral reaction of indignation and moral discomfort, much like how we perceive it today. The difference lies not in the emotions themselves, but in the strategies used to suppress them. Throughout history, societies justified slavery by attributing to the enslaved a potential threat to the survival of the civilized world or by artificially erasing any sense of shared humanity. They divided people into castes or categories, declaring some to be descendants of gods and others as mindless beings born of dirt, convincing themselves that these individuals were destined for subjugation, incapable of enlightenment, or devoid of higher aspirations. More radical methods of erasing common identity manifested through depersonalization, the denial of the fundamental unity of human nature. This is evident in theories that posited separate evolutionary branches or attributed cultural and economic differences to divergent evolutionary processes. Such narratives provided a pseudo-scientific rationale for inequality, casting the success and dominance of certain groups as natural and inevitable. However, when someone previously considered an equal became enslaved, this was perceived not as natural, but as a curse or punishment. It evoked emotions similar to those we feel today when witnessing a lawbreaker being imprisoned. A sense of justice tempered by discomfort. Yet, when the grounds for enslavement were illegitimate or unjust, the reaction was far more radical than modern responses. Such injustices often sparked rebellion or even war, a testament to the deep emotional resonance of perceived equality and its violation. The causes and justifications of slavery will be explored in greater depth in the next chapter. In conclusion, within a rational model of redemption, one that even a skeptic might comprehend, God's sacrifice begins the moment he creates autonomous consciousness. More precisely, in allowing these beings to think independently, God accepts the inevitable possibility of deviation and willingly endures the suffering brought about by the existence of a reality foreign to his nature, yet necessary to sustain free will which became prone to deviation from life-giving principles. This suffering, however, simultaneously serves as a corrective tool, a demonstration that begins to realign deviation with life's eternal order. Yet perhaps the unveiling of God's suffering, since the creation of the world, is not the most exalted model of sacrificial absoluteness. It is conceivable that the ultimate sacrifice of one of the hypostases provides a maximally effective corrective force, appealing to the universal human capacity for emotional perception. By employing this costly pedagogical instrument, God achieves the most profound transformation of human consciousness. In manifesting a love of such magnitude, one that fundamentally transforms the perception of reality, God provokes a deep desire for the principles of life and happiness, while simultaneously revealing the cost and consequences of a misalignment of independent consciousness. This, in turn, instills a visceral revulsion toward distortions of life-giving principles. Such a concept of redemption through God's suffering as presented in the Bible contrasts with interpretations that are solely juridical or sacramental in nature. It offers a more rational and transformative framework, one that guides conscious beings non-coercively toward volitional alignment with the life-giving principles embodied in God.